Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for coming today. It is great to see all of you. We have again with us an extraordinary guest, former Deputy Secretary, Ambassador to Moscow, John Sullivan, who has written a book. I think you concluded the writing, was it December of last year, John? Called Midnight in Moscow. I think you really could have gone to the original title of what I recall as a popular song, to Moscow Nights, plural, because there were many dramatic Moscow nights during your period of service. But we're going to have a dialogue talking about what happened, what's happening, what it means for the United States, for America, for Texas. John has done a series of events, has a series coming up, of discussions with policy institutes throughout Texas, so he is not an occasional visitor only to this great state. But these are profound issues. They matter deeply. They will matter deeply for whatever administration takes power in January. And we're going to try to unpack, explore much of that. But I just want to know for a moment, from you, John, as we start this discussion, you have been a public servant at senior levels over 5 administrations. You have seen both foreign events and domestic events, and in our discussion, I'm going to ask you for that broader context, domestic context, for foreign policy in general, for Russia in specific, because I think that's of interest to all of you, and we'll have some time for questions and answers. As always, I will shamelessly promote our roundtable. Events like this, speakers like John, are made possible because of the support that those of you in our roundtable provide us, just like they say on PBS. And we encourage those of you who are roundtable members, encourage your friends to join. Those of you who may not be, please consider expanding, sustaining the work that we do in this community, in this state, in this country, and with respect to overseas developments. And with that, I'm going to launch this conversation, not just by welcoming you again, you were here in April last year, but to ask you the context of your book and what has happened in the now 9 months since you finished writing. Where is Ukraine going? More important, where's Russia going?
Wow. Well, first, David, great to be with you again. Great to be back at the Baker Institute. I might roll the clock back a little further to when I was here last in April.
Fair enough.
Because there was a significant event in June after I was here, which is the Prigozhin mutiny, right? Which was a real shock to the system in Russia and at the Kremlin. So we've had the Prigozhin mutiny, the failure, and I use the word failure a little reluctantly because we raised expectations for what the Ukrainian military was going to be able to do on the battlefield. The Russian military collapsed in the fall and early winter of 2022, late fall, early winter 2022, around Kharkiv. I mean, just collapsed. And the Ukrainians pushed the Russians out of the major oblast capital, that the only one that the Russians had captured, which was Kherson in the south. So the Ukrainians, on the one hand, don't meet these wild expectations that had been raised, particularly in Western media, that they were going to be able to push the Russians back out of territory that had been seized by Russia since 2014. All is not well on the Russian side. We've got the Prigozhin mutiny. And yes, the Russians have been making territorial gains. And I'll read a blaring headline about major Russian advance in eastern Ukraine. Like, huh? And then I'll read the article, and then I'll go online, and I'll look at the map, and I'll need a microscope to see what territory. This is a strategic, like, somebody's got to give some of these journalists a dictionary and these strategic advances. Look, yes, the Russians have been making gains. The Ukrainians, in bringing it up to the present time, the Ukrainians invaded Russia. The first time since the Second World War, since Stalin's time, Putin has allowed a country coming from the West to invade and capture, occupy Russian territory. So, the Ukrainians have captured, depending on when you look at the calendar and you measure, 500 square miles, maybe it's less, maybe it's 400 square miles, but it's not that much less than everything the Russians have gained in the eastern Donbass. So it's a stalemate right now. And in a stalemate, and in particular a stalemate with both sides still trying to mount offensives, it is already, and at least as on its current trajectory, will be a war of attrition, which is not good for Ukraine. Ukraine is, the Ukrainian population pre-war was a third the size of the Russian population. I just saw a statistic now that the population in the territory that the Zelensky government controls in Ukraine is roughly 27 million people. The Russian population is 140, 145 million people. Pre-war, the Ukrainian population was 45 million. That gives you a sense of how many people, how many refugees have fled, how much territory the Russians have captured. So something's got to give. And my hope is that the U.S. government, whether it's the Biden administration or the next administration, will authorize the Ukrainians to use all the means at their disposal that we, the United States, have given them to defend Ukraine consistent with the law of armed conflict, with international law, not targeting civilians in Russia, but targeting military facilities that are being used by the Russian Federation to kill Ukrainians in Ukraine and devastate the country's, its energy grid, its economy, to unleash that ability that we have given them, but we put a governor on it, and they can't use it to full effect. Putin doesn't want that to happen. He's threatening nuclear war. They're making noises about resuming nuclear testing. They are about to announce a new nuclear weapons policy. They released the last one just as I arrived as ambassador in early 2020. So he's using his nuclear stockpile, the largest in the world, as best he can. He doesn't actually want to use it to detonate a nuclear weapon, but he wants to use it as the Russians and the Soviets have always done, as a form of nuclear blackmail.
So John, let me not walk the clock back, but expand the focus here. Putin, and you talked about this eloquently in your book. You spoke 18 months ago when you were here about this. Who is he, this Chekist, as you described him? What does he really want, and how do you deal with him?
So he is at heart a KGB man. His expression, I write about this in the book. He's been quoted as saying, and when I write in the book, I compare him to a gangster, right? An American, American gangsters in the movies, right? Once you're in the mob, you're never out. Omerta, all that. Putin has said there's no such thing as a KGB man. He himself is drawing comparisons to that type of life. As a former KGB man. Former KGB. Well, there's no such thing as a former KGB man, right? So the KGB has morphed into, on the one hand, the smaller SVR, Foreign Intelligence Service, the much larger FSB, the Federal Security Service. Putin, before he became Prime Minister and President, was the director of the FSB. It's what he's about, and it's not it's about, it's more than, it's not just Russian nationalism, it's Russian imperialism. He wants to restore the Russian Empire. And what does that mean? He has said that the great geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century was the demise of the Soviet Union. And it's not because he valued the communist system. He's said in the past, if you're not nostalgic for how we lived in Soviet days, you don't have a heart. But if you want to return to the communist system, you don't have a brain. So he's not a communist. He owns billion-dollar palaces. He's not a communist. But he's a Russian imperialist, and what he laments about the demise of the Soviet Union is control from Moscow, control from the center, which is what they call Moscow. In the Soviet Union controlled Moscow. The Kremlin controlled the USSR. All the 15 republics, 350 million people. When the Soviet Union dissolved, the internal boundaries of the Soviet Union became international borders. And that separates, from Putin's perspective, a country that he doesn't recognize as a nation, as a nationality, Ukraine. In the Soviet system, yeah, they could have a border, they could Ukrainian SSR, all that, but it was ultimately controlled, mostly for the worse, not for the good, from Moscow. But not so after the Soviet Union collapsed. That international boundary became really the bone that's been stuck in his throat for a long time. And he's been working to get rid of that boundary, minimize it, bring it back to the days when that boundary was, just a dotted line on a map. It didn't really impact how the Soviet Union treated Ukraine. From Putin's perspective, the Soviet Union, Soviet leaders treated Ukraine too well, gave them too much autonomy, gave them Crimea, Khrushchev. Putin wants to reorganize things the way they used to be, not in the Soviet system, but in the Russian Empire. But he's not a czar either. He was asked, after he was reelected in March of 2018, he was asked, this was by state media, Mr. President, you've been reelected to another 6-year term. You will have governed our country for 25 years if you serve through the end of this term. Why aren't you really like a czar? You've been our czar. Aren't you a czar? And he said, oh, heck no. I don't know what the equivalent of hell no is in Ruski. I don't speak Russian. He was almost insulted, and he said, no, I've earned everything that I got. I didn't inherit this because my father or my grandfather was the czar. I worked for this. And so he's more than a czar. He's worked for this. He's built this. This is his Russian Federation, and he's regathering those Russian lands. This is not a policy exercise, a foreign policy exercise for Putin. This is about who he is as a person and as a Russian. And from his perspective, Ukraine is part of the Ruski Mir. It doesn't exist as an independent country, no matter what international lawyers and people at the UN or in Washington or in Brussels say. Ukraine, from his perspective, is ours. Really, the way he thinks about it is mine. And he is never gonna surrender his war aims, which are to demilitarize and denazify Ukraine and render it controllable from the center, from Moscow, the way it was in communist days.
John, you've written, and we just had a discussion with students. We talked about, this is of course about Ukraine and the Ukrainians, but more importantly, it's about Russia. It's not about Ukraine policy, what you do and don't do vis-a-vis Ukraine. It's what you do or don't do about Russia. And that's something every administration whatever its political color may be, has to take on. Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, that's a very important point, David. I spend a lot of time in Washington talking to mostly people on Capitol Hill, members of Congress, Republicans. I'm a lifelong Republican, and I'm disheartened when I hear Republicans on the Hill say things like, why are we worried more about Ukraine's borders than we are about our border, our southern border in the United States? People going so far as to say, I think the junior senator from Ohio, or vice presidential candidate, has said, in effect, I don't care about Ukraine. Okay, so I go in, I'm prepared to talk about all the reasons why the United States should support Ukraine. But I'm prepared to do that because it's part of a larger objective. And I will, for purposes of the discussion, will say, okay, let's just accept that point for now. What's your policy then for addressing that aggressive Russia that we face in the East? And my friend General Cavoli, who's now our SACU, our Supreme Commander in Europe, military commander and the head of EUCOM, the U.S. Military Command for Europe, said a month or two ago, whether there's a ceasefire in Ukraine, whatever happens in Ukraine, particularly if there's a ceasefire, we in NATO, we the United States, are going to have to confront a large, angry, heavily armed Russia for the foreseeable future. And if you don't want to oppose Putin in Ukraine, what's your plan for addressing all of the threats that the Russian Federation poses to the United States? And if you're not willing to say that the Russian Federation poses threats to the United States, then why does the United States have, if you include the black budgets and the IC, $1 trillion defending ourselves? It's not just about the PRC, it's about Russia. We've been dealing with this problem for decades. And it's the same problem that Kennan was looking at in 1946-47 when he writes his famous long telegram and X article in Foreign Affairs. He'd been the deputy chief of mission during the Second World War under Ambassador Averell Harriman. And he writes about, and he uses, it's interesting, and I spent a lot of time, and I write about this in the book, reading everything that Kennan had written about Russia and the Soviet Union. He uses Russians and Soviets interchangeably. And the Russian Federation today, the Russians themselves will say, Putin would say, the Russian Federation isn't the Soviet Union. It is not the economic colossus that the Soviet Union was, 350 million people. But the key point is the control in Moscow, and that's what it all comes back to. And what Kennan writes about that in 46, some of his observations, you substitute Putin for Stalin, Russian Federation for Soviet Union, and I do this in my book. Boy, what he said all those years ago is just as true today. And so to bring it to finally to the discussion about Russia policy, yes, it's important for the United States to support Ukraine. Why? Because it's the key component of a strategy to address and push back against the Russian aggression that we're already spending hundreds of billions of dollars to oppose in our defense budget. If you vote for our defense budget as a member of Congress, and you spend all that money to address the threat posed by Russia, why are you not willing to spend a fraction of that, or in fact, redirect a fraction of that to oppose Russian aggression in Ukraine? Because if you don't, and Putin succeeds, and what do I mean by succeed? even if he just achieves what he's got today, if the line of contact in Ukraine, well, first he's got to expel the Ukrainians from the Kursk region. He can't let that linger. He has to do that. If you freeze that border in the Donbass and cede Crimea, even if you say, and the Senator Vance has said, I think my recollection he said, freeze the line of contact and have a pledge that Ukraine will remain neutral and not a member of NATO. Even if you say that the Ukrainians have self-determination and can decide to join NATO, even if you grant that, you give Putin that territory, what he has achieved to date, it is not fanciful to imagine what comes next. And it's already coming, right? In Moldova, in Georgia. We see it to this right today, what's going on. Elections in Georgia. Well, okay, so then you extend the question. Well, I don't care about Georgia. I don't care about Moldova. And here's where I write about in my book, and I'm sorry, I'll stop my soliloquy here and turn to another question. If you ask the average person on the street in Houston or in my hometown of Boston in 1938, where's the Sudetenland? It's near Charlestown in Boston. I know.
A faraway people of whom we know nothing.
Why do we care?
Yeah.
And so I became, because I'm a lawyer and I've always been interested in the International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg, and in particular, the chief American prosecutor, Justice Jackson. And Jackson is really eloquent in both his opening statement and in his summation to the judges. And the case is brought against the principal Nazi leaders. By that point, of course, Hitler had committed suicide before the war ended. But Bormann was missing. He was charged, but he was still at large. It wasn't confirmed he was dead. But everybody else is on trial from Goering on down. And he has this, and it echoes today. He said, twice in this century, the 20th century, the United States made the mistake of thinking we could just ignore a major war going on the European continent. The Great War, right? The United States doesn't enter the Great War until 1917. The United States, the Second World War had been going on for more than 2 years when Pearl Harbor was bombed, and then a few days later, Hitler declares war on Germany. The United Kingdom had been fighting for 2 years in the Soviet Union. Now, of course, the Roosevelt administration through Lend-Lease, right, supporting our valiant Soviet allies in ways that today they are really loath to admit that how much help they got from the United States and the difference that it made in resisting Operation Barbarossa. But to get back to Jackson said, we made that mistake once with the Great War, and then we did it again. We're doing it again now. And my fear is, again, coming back to the interwar years, I mean, some of the most famous books, speeches that were written during the interwar years focused on the threat from Nazi Germany. Churchill's speeches were collected into a book that was published in the United States, and the title was While England Slept. Jack Kennedy, as a senior at Harvard, writes his honors thesis, and the title of it was Why England Slept. And, we've seen this, and, talk about history rhyming. Tucker Carlson interviewed somebody who claims to be a historian, who now says that Churchill was really the villain in the Second World War and not Hitler. I mean, we're turning rationality on. I mean, it's just irrational, some of the things we're saying, Americans are saying to each other. But another book, At dawn we slept, the attack on Pearl Harbor. The sleep metaphor used for the United States and the West in the interwar years to the threat posed principally by Nazi Germany, but also by the Empire of Japan. We're asleep again today. We really are. We think we can afford the type of frivolous politics that we're witnessing. There's no leadership. I don't want to get partisan, it's both sides. People aren't focusing, people in Washington, people who should know better, are not focused on the serious problems and challenges that the United States faces, and that a new administration, no matter which candidate wins in November, I've just been talking about Russia, Ukraine, but there's a bigger, badder world out there, whether it's Gaza and Lebanon, Taiwan. It's as dangerous a time, I believe, as any in my lifetime. And I was alive during the Cuban Missile Crisis, what the Russians call the Caribbean crisis. It's that bad. And I've always been the person, I've always been the person who, when someone makes the extravagant, oh, it's as bad, I was always the person who said, nah, it's not as bad now as it was, in 1859, 60 or whatever. And maybe we're not at Civil War, 1859, 1860, President Buchanan level yet, but we are asleep, and our adversaries are taking advantage of that and know we're asleep. So it requires leadership. I ultimately have confidence in our country based on my experience. To quote Churchill, the great villain of the Second World War, that Americans will always do the right thing after exhausting all other possibilities. That eventually, but my fear is there's gonna be a Pearl Harbor-like moment that shocks this country into realizing what's happening.
John, I have to pivot exactly from your point to ask you a question. You and I were both in the administration during the, I think, quite extraordinary public intelligence and private campaign of telling Putin, we know exactly what you're planning to do.
Right.
We know city by city, location by location, unit by unit, what your plans are, what the FSB role is to be, and it was critical. We know you're getting pushback from your services through all of this, and we made it public, the most sensitive intelligence we had, to do two things: to try to dissuade Putin from a sense that he had any surprise here, and to build a coalition in advance. Brilliantly managed. It doesn't work. 24th of February, 6 a.m. in the morning, you're given the coded message that he's moved, although it was clear he was going to do this to all of us from about the middle of January. What we didn't know was the date. So all of that brilliantly handled, but then we go to a strategy. And I'm not saying this in a critical or pejorative sense, I'm trying to be objective, of concern over escalation that could lead to a nuclear conflict. And the continuous, over months, then years to today, withholding of either weapons or targeting information, not because it would be right to help Ukraine, but the fear of engaging in a nuclear confrontation with Russia as the ultimate concern, but the immediate concern of it's no longer a war with a coalition, it is a war between Russia and the United States. Your thoughts on what could have been done and what needs to be done now?
Well, David, you've captured, I think, what happened. You're right, I would characterize it as fear. Not irrational fear, but fear. I think it's fear premised on a continuing hope. And President Biden hates it if you say, he got asked that question at Geneva in June of 2021 when he met with Putin at his press conference. And a reporter said, why do you hope that Putin is going to, I never said anything about hope, blah, blah, blah. I think deep down, the fear is compounded by a lack of understanding of how adamant our enemy is, and the enemy is the Russian Federation. I use that word because Putin uses that word to describe the United States and our vassals, his word, our vassals in NATO. He's already said for over 2 years that Russia is at war with the United States and NATO. He recently said, if you authorize those long-range strike weapons for use inside Russia, well, then you'll be at war with Russia. And my first reaction was, in September of 2022, you said Russia was at war with the United States and Ukraine. We're the enemy. I write about this in the book. This is before the war. U.S. policy, and it's bipartisan, Trump to Biden. We want to put guardrails on the U.S. relationship with Russia. The underlying thrust to me as ambassador was, just make this, put a socket in, ambassador. Yeah, we understand how bad it is, but we got to pivot to Asia. We got to focus on the generational challenge, which is the PRC. So just, make it stop. Minimize it. Do something. And that was the subtext. The text was, we want guardrails. We want to work with the Russians where we can and oppose them where we must. There's still that mindset in Washington. And I think people are afraid to admit that Russia believes, Putin believes, honestly, that he's at war with the United States. It's a hybrid war, but it is a war, and it's a war that is in many ways more serious than the Cold War. I mean, the Russians are killing people on the streets of Berlin and Salisbury. Openly, officers of the GRU and the FSB, not agents, not a Spanish diplomat who whacks Trotsky in Mexico City. FSB colonel, GRU officers committing assassinations in Salisbury and Berlin, and it's going to come to the United States. I guarantee it. Maybe not to a U.S. citizen. So the fear is, if we ultimately acknowledge the threat that the Russian Federation poses to the United States, then we're in a whole different world. And I'll give you one more example, and I think fear influenced this in some ways. You may remember the Afghan bounty story, right? The story that broke, that was leaked. There's a problem right there, that something like this would leak before it was fully vetted and addressed by the United States government, that the GRU was paying the Taliban bounties to kill American troops in Afghanistan for a variety of reasons, including trying to drive the United States out of Afghanistan, and in addition to killing Americans, which they think is a good thing. It leaked, and both President Trump and candidate Biden reacted, took two extreme positions. Trump said, the Russians deny it, the intelligence community, what do they know? Nothing to see there. What did Biden say? Biden said, by God, Putin is going to pay for killing Americans. I mean, he really got his Irish up, and I say that as a Sullivan, proud of our mutual Irish heritage. There was a footnote. Now, it was one of these. Of course, the intelligence will have to be verified. But boy, Putin, he's going to pay. What happened when he became president? Intelligence communities divided. If the American people thought that the GRU was paying the Taliban to kill Americans, and we had proof of, as I believe, dead Marines in Afghanistan who were killed only because of the collaboration between the GRU and the Taliban, then we're getting close to war with the Russian Federation. And people in Washington are afraid of it. I'm afraid of it, but we can't stick our head in the sand. And that's what the administration, my fear is, I hope it's going to change. They're sticking their head in the sand, and they think that if we limit the range of the long-range strike missiles that we're giving the Ukrainians, and we don't cross this red line, someday we'll get to a place where we've got a negotiated settlement and we could go back to putting guardrail. That's over. Putin will never surrender in Ukraine, and we just have to accept that as a fact. I'm not saying we go to war with Russia, but our policy decisions get skewed and are misguided when we don't acknowledge that premise up front, that Russia, Putin, has declared war on the United States and called us an enemy.
John, we're going to turn in a moment to the many questions from the audience, but I'm going to add a personal observation of this. I spent many, many hours over 15, 16 years in conversation with former KGB head, Prime Minister Yevgeny Primakov, the premier Arabist Middle East specialist in Soviet Union and the early Russian Federation. And Primakov would say, you can believe what I'm telling you, you cannot. But I'm telling you the way Putin thinks. He hates you all. Not just the US and NATO, all of you, north, south, east, west, Muslims, non-Muslims, because you broke his world, the Soviet Union, and then you danced his phrase on its rubble. You tried to collapse the economy of the Russian Federation, and he will get his revenge, and his comeuppance will come in the form of a challenge to all of you, to the world, that demonstrates Russia can never again be humiliated, can never again be taken for granted. And it's just, this motivates this angry, his words, little man.
Sort of reminds you of a European leader in the 20s and 30s. I may be wrong about that.
So, we'll turn to questions, many of which are, and I'll sort of summarize a number of them. Can there be a settlement, a political negotiation in Ukraine that involves territorial concessions, de facto, de jure? Would Russia honor the outcome of any such negotiation? Should the U.S. support it?
So the last question, well, the penultimate question, would Russia honor any concessions? No. My experience in dealing with the Russian government is only if they are held to account with threats will they honor concessions agreements that they've made. And they promised in writing, not just the oral statements by Putin and Lavrov. Lavrov, in writing, a week before the war started, said there would not be an invasion and they had no plans to invade. So, no. You can't trust them. And so, yeah, there's the possibility for there will be at most a ceasefire, which the Ukrainians don't want, because they believe it will give Putin he will be further entrenched in the areas he's already conquered, and it will give him more time to regroup and refit and not allow the Ukrainians to blow up with drones weapons depots in the Russian Federation. But it's possible, but Putin will never concede any territory that Russia has claimed is now part of the Russian Federation. So there are 4 oblasts in eastern Ukraine, which the Russian Federation has. They had an election in those areas, and they claim that the residents voted to join the Russian Federation. Those Ukrainian oblasts have now become part of the Russian Federation, in addition to Crimea. The Russian Constitution was amended the amendment was proposed in January of 2020, adopted in April, and voted on in a plebiscite in late June of 2020. It was part of a package. The most prominent constitutional amendment was to the term limits in the Russian Constitution, which allowed Putin to run for 2 more 6-year terms. But not a lot of attention was paid to the constitutional amendment that makes it illegal, unconstitutional, for a Russian leader to separate even the smallest bit of Russian territory from the Russian Federation. It's unconstitutional. His hands are tied. I made the point, because I'm a pain in the neck, and I like to tweak the Russians. I said, geez, it's a good thing Secretary Seward didn't have to worry about that when you did us the favor of selling us Alaska. Thanks, guys. I was not popular. But no, he's never going to surrender that territory. That's his. That's Russia. Imagine, it would be the equivalent of, a country demanding one of the 50 states and the American president saying, yeah, for peace with China, we'll give them Alaska. We got it from the Russians. We stole it from the Russians. We'll give it to the... It's just not going to happen. He doesn't think that way. It is unthinkable for him to do that. Anyone who premises negotiations, and we shouldn't even use that word in discussing what we would do with the Russians. As soon as a Westerner, particularly our friends and colleagues at the State Department, start talking about negotiations, we approach them like Westerners and not like Russians. We start talking about good faith gestures. As a good faith gesture, he will pocket that good faith gesture and wait for more. He just interprets it as weakness. We don't listen to them. He will never surrender that territory.
And how long, another question, do we have to deal with Putin? What are, if there are any, internal pressures that he has to deal with? And more importantly, what happens when the man passes from the scene?
Yeah, well, I was just going to say, in response to the first question, we got to check with the good Lord upstairs on that one. And do not rely on the U.S. government. Our friends in the intelligence community are the worst at diagnosing health problems in foreign leaders. Whether it's Ayatollah Khomeini in Tehran, Fidel Castro, who was dying of cancer for 15 years, the Shah, we are the worst. And our mutual friend Bill Burns, I think, hit the nail on the head when he said the problem with Putin's health is that he's too healthy. But it's not just, so I've focused a lot of my remarks in my book on Putin, but Putin is, it's not just Putin. And this goes back, and this is where I think Kennan is so important. This isn't just Putin. This is a mindset in Russia that we've confronted, the world has confronted for a long, long time. And we will have to continue to confront it, whatever happens in Ukraine. Containing, and I use that word in the sense that Kennan did.
Yes.
Containment got, that's the word as used in Kennan's writings in the mid-40s. Containment then gets expanded and it changed over time by the Truman, Eisenhower, Kennedy, Johnson administrations, and Vietnam, and all that. The original concept of containment that Kennan writes about, I think needs to be the U.S. policy today. We need to confront and acknowledge the aggressive and dangerous Russia that's governed by this government, led by Putin, but supported by the oligarchs and a lot of other, Russian nationalists. We've got to have a containment policy for this problem. Now, for Putin, if he doesn't wake up tomorrow, is the war in Ukraine going to end? Of course not. look, Russian nationalists, the majority of Russians, they want Russia to succeed. They don't want Russia to be embarrassed. They don't want their boys, their troops in Ukraine to be defeated. The average Russian wants Russia to be successful. So no, this war isn't going to stop. And in fact, I've had many Russians tell me that, when I was ambassador, tell your American friends to be wary about looking for regime change here, because the next Russian leader, if you replace Putin, may be even worse. And if you listen to some of the rhetoric from some of the people, the nationalists around Putin, that's easy to imagine.
Thank you, John, for raising Kennan-esque containment, because one of the paradoxes of current foreign policy at the pundit level, expert level, and practitioner level is the dramatic experience of 89 to 91, end of Soviet domination in Eastern Europe, fall of the wall, collapse of the Soviet Union, Francis Fukuyama's end of history, is we expect everything to be a black and white definitive resolution.
Yeah.
Let's recall, and it's bipartisan, it was Madeleine Albright, champion of liberal democratic policies, Big D, who first raised in her Georgetown speech, we don't want containment, which we had advocated at the beginning of the Clinton administration on Iraq and Iran. Where's regime change? And that opened the long path that led to 2003 and what happened in Iraq. But aggressive, dynamic, nuanced containment as an effective strategy is something that got burned. Nobody wants to talk about the C word because it requires strategic patience and cleverness.
And also cohesion within the United States. I mean, the most important part of what Kennan wrote about in the 40s was about the United States. I mean, his thesis was, he lays out this strategy of a civilizational, and as he phrased it, between Soviet Union, Soviet communism, and the West and the United States. We don't have the communist ideology element of it, but it's a similar, Putin describes it as such, a civilizational struggle. And Kennan's thesis is, of course the United States will prevail ultimately, he didn't say when, ultimately in this, but only if we're united at home. And every advance we make in addressing our own problems, imagine what he's talking about in 46, 47, the stronger we are domestically in the United States, the more likely it is, in fact, Kennan was certain that the United States would ultimately prevail. And if we were not going to prevail, it was because of divisions. We would have done it to ourselves. And that's just as true today.
John, let's talk about the Russian challenge here in the United States. You made a brief reference to it. Cyber attacks, the threat posed by Russian aggressive intelligence tactics here in the U.S., and second question, related, Russian interference in the elections.
Sure. On the election interference, the Russians aren't the only ones. The Iranians and the PRC are equal opportunity interferers. The media likes to focus on, with good reason, the Russian interference, but it's a problem that cuts across enemies, opponents, adversaries, competitors of the United States. Same with cyber, by the PRC and Russia. What distinguishes the Russians is their brutality. I mean, they really, Putin, so long as they can get away with it, he just doesn't care. He'll send an FSB colonel to shoot somebody in the back of the head in the middle of a park in Berlin with little kids standing nearby. He doesn't care. He'll send GRU officers to Salisbury to use an incredibly dangerous nerve agent, this Novichok nerve agent. Novichok means new guy in Russia, this new nerve agent, which caused the city to have to be shut down. Many people got deathly sick, didn't die. Dawn Sturgis, a woman, did die. And the intended target of the assassination, Skripal, survived. That's pretty brutal. And so when I say there's a hybrid war against the United States, he has no qualms about doing that on our territory. Now, the targets of those attacks was not a German citizen in Berlin or a UK citizen in Salisbury, just like killing Trotsky in Mexico City. But I guarantee, I'll make a prediction. I don't know how long it's going to take. It may have already happened. There are opponents of Putin and the Russian Federation in the United States, some getting the protection of the United States government, who have been and will be targeted and assassinated here in our country by Russia. That's just a fact. I'll give you a little fact about Houston. Houston, the Russian, I don't know, is anybody from the Russian consulate here? Last time I spoke, no? Last time I spoke, there were two gentlemen in the front row from the Russian consulate in Houston when David and I were speaking last April of last year. The consulate is very valuable to the Russian Federation. My friends at NASA may not like this. Anybody from NASA here, I apologize. But the consulate, the officers, I don't think I write about this, I believe, in the book. And I hope I'll try to be careful about what I say. It's not the Russian officers, diplomats who are assigned. There are only a handful, like 10 or 12, I believe, assigned to the consulate here in Houston. Why is that valuable to them? Because they send their assets in through another means, through their channels with NASA and the Johnson Space Center. They need that consulate as a base of operations. And that's in your hometown. That's what they're doing here.
It's why we shut the PRC consulate down, including the ties to this campus and the engineering and research sections.
One of my colleagues at Embassy Moscow, and we were, talking about these types of issues, and he just sort of looked at the ceiling and said, that's what you get when you make a KGB colonel your president. I mean, you use your diplomatic platforms for virtually only for intelligence purposes.
John, economic sanctions.
Yeah.
The oil and gas industry in Russia.
Yeah.
More that can be done?
Oh, absolutely. But the problem is, the administration, it's similar to military support for Ukraine, is making sure that the energy sanctions don't have more blowback on Western economies than they do in the Russian Federation. Russia is a superpower. It's an energy superpower and a nuclear weapons superpower, and those are the weapons that Putin uses. The money from the energy sales, the oil and gas, props up the Russian economy. There's rampant inflation. He's inflicting huge long-term damage on the Russian economy, but he's put it on a war footing. He's going to spend a third of the Russian government's budget on defense and military matters in the next fiscal year, and they are going to do what it takes to prevail in Ukraine.
And if doing what it takes would come to the point of requiring either a demonstration or an actual use of some form of nuclear device, I'm asking for your opinion here, because there are no certainties in this. What do you think?
So what I think is that they will stop, what would cause Putin to actually do that? And here I go back to the Prigozhin mutiny in June of last year. If instead of rogue elements of this Wagner private military contractor, this was the Ukrainian military, or even worse, the Ukrainian military with mutinous soldiers from the Russian military that were headed to Moscow, that's a situation where not only, where Putin might think, my government, remember what's happening in June of last year. Wagner is shooting down Russian helicopters, heading to Moscow. Now, they said, at the time, Prigozhin said, we're doing this ultimately to support our dear president, our dear Vova, Vladimir Vladimirovich. We're doing this because you don't understand what your Minister of Defense and your Chief of the General Staff, Colonel General Gerasimov, are doing. We're going to remove them, and we're doing this for you. If this is President Zelensky, who has got Ukrainians and maybe an international league, that's, I think, the type of threat that would ultimately, where Putin would consider use. He won't use, my opinion, wouldn't use a nuclear weapon in any form, whether it's let me be careful. He wouldn't use a tactical nuclear weapon on the battlefield or even a demonstration strike. But what he might very well do is resume nuclear weapons testing, which is a big deal. That is not a battlefield use, not a strategic use, not a use, but it's testing. And because if he uses a nuclear weapon, he risks losing the support of the PRC and his dear friend Xi Jinping in the global South and the rest of the world. That threat, I think, it would have to be a threat to the continuation of the regime, of the nature of, as I say, a military threat that would remove the leadership in the Kremlin. Someone doing to Russia and to Moscow what the Russians tried to do to Ukraine and Kyiv in February and March of 2022, which was to sack Kyiv, remove the Zelensky government.
John, I'll end this on not a question, but an observation. You not only served at an extraordinary set of moments in world history and U.S. Russian relations, but you served in a mission subject to, in my experience, unprecedented and sustained over years extraordinary challenge and threat. People here might not realize. The embassy was progressively targeted, its staff drawn down, ability to hire and retain what we call locally employed staff, foreign service nationals, restricted. The American school shut down. Tandem couples where both spouses are officers, Russia would deny or expel one, knowing that the other would have to go as well. And careful selection of which officers they didn't want to come, not because they were political officers or intelligence officers, but they were technicians. They were the people who kept the mission running, kept those massive buildings functioning. You had to leave Spaso House, which had its own challenges,
right.
But this vast treasury of art and architecture, and then the security detail was taken away. You had to live in a townhouse on that compound, where everybody to this day takes on cleaning detail to work. That's an extraordinary experience on top of the world you were dealing with.
Yeah, and you know what? I try to convey a sense of it in the book, the stress. So every time an American, and I mean a teenager, a spouse, a Marine staff sergeant, the ambassador, left the compound, they were immediately tailed by the FSB, every single person. And but over time, it just, people taking walking, going to the supermarket, and people taking your picture with their cell phone and, getting in your face and trying to hand you things to take a picture to show you're accepting, some envelope and some nefarious scheme. It just, over time, individually, it's, you know, you can deal with it, but over time it just starts to wear you down. One day I came to work, and our RSO, our regional security officer, said somebody had early in the morning had a big plastic bag filled with blood, and they threw it over the wall. Why? I mean, we tested, it wasn't human blood, it was animal blood. What? You know, throwing chicken, you know, have two dog, I'm a dog lover, two dog parks in the embassy. One of them runs along the outer perimeter wall, you know, throwing chicken bones over the wall so the dogs, you know, eat and choke to death on them. Most everyone had relocated to the compound, but people who lived off the compound, you know, visits while they were gone by the FSB with little signals that they'd been there to visit. It just, over time, we have a whole, you may have heard the expression Moscow rules. There's a big, thick, classified book on how we operate at Embassy Moscow, because it's different from every other embassy U.S. embassy or consulate in the world because of the counterintelligence threat. But then there are the informal Moscow rules, sort of the information that's been passed down from generation to generation that people pick up. And among the most important ones is there are no coincidences. Geez, that guy behind us in the line at the movie theater, he looks like the guy who, remember the bag of carrots I was trying to buy at the grocery store yesterday, and some guy came and, is that the same guy? It's not a coincidence. They are out to get us. And it's that stress which is important to deal with, and why we, the United States, the Foreign Service, the Director General of the Foreign Service, the Department, will limit, and across the U.S. government, because of course it's not just the State Department, limit the amount of time anybody who wants to stay more than 3 years at post. Most people stay only 2 if they're not expelled before then. But if they want to stay more than 3, it has to be approved by the ambassador and the Secretary of State, just because the stress it's hard to deal with over time. Think about this. You have a medical emergency. You go to a Russian hospital and you get put under anesthetic. What are they going to ask you? So, I mean, I won't get it, but I mean, just your whole life is, you're in this beautiful city, Moscow, but you're surrounded by, the FSB is, I think this is right, it's roughly 350,000 people in the FSB. To give you a sense, I think the FBI is 35,000. There's 7,000 Russian officers in the FSB in their counterintelligence section, DCRO 1, which is dedicated to the U.S. mission to Russia. 7,000 Russians who all they do is focus on smother the U.S. embassy in Moscow 24/7. And they needed 7,000 when we had 1,200 employees, most of them Russian nationals, to be sure, third country nationals, but still 400 or 500 U.S. diplomats. We're now down to, I don't know what the exact number is today, but 150, 180. And they have 7,000 FSB officers who are looking to embarrass, compromise, humiliate the personnel at Embassy Moscow, and it's the stress that really gets to people over time.
John, you were an absolutely exceptional Deputy Secretary of State, an extraordinarily thoughtful and decent ambassador. You're a great American. Your uncle, William Sullivan, our last ambassador to Iran, would be very proud.
Well, thank you. The real ambassador, he was a career, like you, a career member of the Foreign Service, senior Foreign Service officer, 3-time ambassador. He's the real ambassador, Sullivan. I'm a pretender.
You both are. Thank you, John.
My pleasure, David.
Thank you all.